Welcome to Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a subject that's, well, it's been making headlines and stirring up a fair bit of debate. We're talking about the use of presidential emergency powers, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose tariffs. We've seen some pretty unprecedented moves recently, haven't we? And the legal challenges they've sparked are really reshaping how we think about global trade and executive authority. It's a fascinating, definitely complex area, and it has huge implications for businesses and, consumers like all of us.
Absolutely. What's really insightful here, I think, is how this law from 1977, it was originally meant for very specific foreign policy crises.
Yeah.
How it's now being stretched, you could say, to tackle these broad economic issues. It really shows the elastic nature of executive power in a crisis. So yeah, we'll explore its origins, look at how it's been used over the years, and then really unpack these recent Liberation Day tariffs and the intense legal fight that came after.
Right. So our mission today is to help you get a handle on the core of IEPA, the details of these specific tariffs, and crucially, why this legal showdown matters so much, not just for trade policy, but maybe even for constitutional law here in the U.S.
Okay, let's delve in. Let's start right at the beginning. What exactly is IEPA? Why was it even created back then?
Okay, so IETA stands for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's a U.S. federal law, signed into law December 28, 1977 by President Carter. Its main job, its primary purpose, is to give the president authority to regulate international commerce. But, and this is key, only after declaring a national emergency. And that emergency has to be tied to an unusual and extraordinary threat to the U.S., a threat that comes mostly or entirely from outside the country.
Okay, so an emergency is declared. What powers does the president actually get then? Is it sort of a blank check? Not quite a blank check, no. Once that declaration is made, the president can block transactions and freeze assets connected to the threat. But the act also builds in some checks. The president has to report to Congress every 6 months, explain the situation, the threat, what actions are being taken, and importantly, any emergency declared under IEPA isn't permanent. It has to be renewed every year to stay active. That falls under the National Emergencies Act rules. So yes, it allows for quick, decisive action, but there's meant to be ongoing accountability.
Right, so powerful action, but with guardrails. Now, I remember hearing there are specific things IEPA doesn't allow the president to do, correct? Even in an emergency.
That's a really crucial point,
Okay.
Yes. The law specifically says the president cannot use this authority to regulate or ban communications if they don't involve transferring something of value. It also explicitly excludes importing or exporting information or informational materials, things like books, films, news reports. Also, transactions related to travel are generally excluded. And humanitarian aid, things like food, clothing, medicine, are also generally off limits, unless the president makes a specific finding that regulating them is necessary to deal with the threat. That exclusion for informational materials is really important. It's known as the Berman Amendment.
The Berman Amendment, right.
Yeah, and it was specifically put in to protect the free flow of information, even during emergencies. It shows Congress was trying to limit potential overreach.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. We know IPA has been used over the years. Can you give us a couple of examples? Show how its use has maybe shifted.
Certainly. Historically, you have to remember IEPA was actually passed to clarify and, importantly, restrict presidential power. Before IEPA, presidents used the much broader trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, TWA. IEPA was meant to narrow that. So for instance, President Carter used IEPA during the Iran hostage crisis. That was mainly about freezing Iranian government assets to protect U.S. interests. Pretty targeted.
Okay, asset freezing.
Right. Then after the 9/11 attacks, President George W. Bush used IEPA, specifically Executive Order 13224, to block assets of terrorist groups. The USA Patriot Act later built on those powers, still focused on financial flows and assets.
Makes sense.
More recently, though, things got, well, more controversial. During the Trump administration, IEPA was used to sanction officials from the International Criminal Court, and perhaps most famously before the tariffs, to try and force the removal of TikTok and WeChat from U.S. app stores.
Ah, yes, I remember that.
But the courts actually blocked those attempts on TikTok and WeChat, and they cited that very informational materials exemption, the Berman Amendment we just talked about. So you can see this tension building over how the law is applied. A tool meant to restrict power starts being used in arguably more expansive ways.
That sets the stage perfectly. So let's fast forward. We've seen this historical use, mostly asset freezes, some controversy, then boom, April 2nd, 2025. President Trump calls it Liberation Day. What happened?
Right, April 2nd, 2025, a significant day. President Trump signed Executive Order 14257. It declared a national emergency, citing the U.S. trade deficit and, interestingly, fentanyl trafficking as the extraordinary threats. And based on that emergency, he invoked IEPA to authorize sweeping new import duties tariffs. He also signed a second order, 140256, which targeted China specifically by closing something called the de minimis loophole for imports from there.
The de minimis, that's the rule allowing small packages, usually under $800, to come in duty-free.
Exactly. Closing that for China was another major step, escalating trade tensions.
Okay, and these new broad duties were called reciprocal tariffs. What did that label mean, and how are they supposed to work in practice?
The administration's line was that these tariffs mirrored or counteracted trade barriers that U.S. exporters supposedly faced abroad, hence reciprocal. The policy itself had two parts. First, a baseline 10% tariff on imports from almost every country, starting April 5th. Then on top of that, additional country-specific reciprocal tariffs. These range from 11% up to 50%. These kicked in April 9th and targeted countries the U.S. had the largest trade deficits with.
And there was a formula for calculating those extra tariffs.
Yes, there was. It was based on the U.S. trade deficit in goods with a specific country. Then you divide that by the value of U.S. imports from that same country. And then you take that resulting percentage and have it.
Yeah.
That became the additional tariff rate.
Okay, a formula based on trade deficits. Sounds straightforward, maybe. But how did actual trade experts and economists react? Did they buy the reciprocal claim? Did the formula make sense to them?
No, not really. Trade analysts pretty much widely rejected the reciprocal label. They pointed out these new U.S. tariffs often far exceeded any tariffs imposed by other countries on U.S. goods. And confusingly, the list even included some countries where the U.S. actually had a trade surplus, like Australia. So the reciprocity argument didn't quite hold up under scrutiny.
Okay.
And the formula itself. Many economists called it overly simplistic. They argued it had little connection to actual real-world trade barriers that companies face. There was one rather biting comment likening it to, quote, taxing you on the number of vowels in your name.
Wow, that's quite a criticism, saying it's arbitrary, basically.
Precisely. The subtext is that it seemed detached from sound economic principles, potentially becoming punitive without clear justification, which of course creates huge global uncertainty.
And speaking of uncertainty, it sounds like there were some, odd entries on the tariff list itself, maybe data glitches.
Indeed. That added to the confusion. The initial list included places like, get this, the uninhabited Heard Island and McDonald Islands.
Uninhabited.
Yep. And also tiny Norfolk Island. Both are actually Australian territories. Reports suggested this might have been due to basically bad data. Some import records might have been misclassified, showing goods originating from these remote spots when they obviously didn't. But beyond those quirks, the highest tariffs, hitting that 50% mark, were applied to countries like Lesotho, Cambodia, Laos, Madagascar, Vietnam, and Myanmar.
Okay, what about the flip side? Which countries got excluded from these reciprocal tariffs, and was the reasoning clear?
6 countries were explicitly exempted: Belarus, Canada, Cuba, Mexico, North Korea, and Russia. The White House gave explanations. For Canada and Mexico, they said it was because of earlier executive orders already imposing 25% tariffs on goods not covered by the USMCA trade deal.
Okay, that makes some sense.
For Russia, Belarus, Cuba, and North Korea, the stated reason was that existing U.S. sanctions already, quote, preclude meaningful trade. Though it's worth noting, U.S.-Russia trade was still pretty substantial in 2024, so that raised some questions.
Interesting inconsistency.
And adding to the puzzle, Syria, which has been under U.S. sanctions for 2 decades, did get hit with a heightened tariff. So the logic wasn't always perfectly consistent.
With all these sweeping changes announced so quickly, what was the immediate reaction? What happened in global markets?
The reaction was swift and, frankly, brutal. The Liberation Day announcement triggered an immediate global market crash. On April 3rd, the day after, the S&P 500 index dropped almost 5%. The NASDAQ composite fell nearly 6%.
That's huge.
It was the NASDAQ's largest single-day point loss in its history. This extreme volatility, combined with the real fear of global retaliation, led to what analysts called a simultaneous collapse in the price of all U.S. assets. It was a very clear signal of the market's deep unease with this kind of unilateral, unpredictable action.
So markets reeling. What did this mean day to day for businesses actually trying to operate, trying to plan?
It meant significant distress, huge uncertainty. It's incredibly hard for businesses to make investment decisions, manage supply chains, or even set prices when the tariff landscape can shift so drastically overnight. We saw evidence of this. For example, the Institute of Supply Management's monthly report showed new orders in manufacturing fell for 4 straight months, starting back in February 2025. And many businesses surveyed explicitly pointed to tariff uncertainty as a major headwind.
Okay, so major economic disruption, market turmoil. It seems almost inevitable that this kind of action would end up in court, right?
You're right.
This brings us to the legal challenges. What's the core constitutional argument against using IEPA for these broad tariffs? Exactly. This really gets to a fundamental question about American governance. Who has the power to tax? The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, is pretty explicit. It grants Congress, not the president, the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and also the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. The core argument from critics is that tariffs are taxes. They are duties, imposts. Therefore, the power to impose them should belong solely to Congress, the people's elected representatives, unless Congress has very clearly and narrowly delegated that specific authority to the president. Right, and the argument then is that IEPA, despite having language about regulating commerce, that it wasn't meant to be that kind of delegation. It wasn't meant for setting broad tariffs.
Precisely. Legal scholars dig into the text and history. They point out IEEP itself never actually mentions the words tariffs, duties, or imposts. Its legislative history, the debates around its passage in 1977, suggest it was intended for more targeted actions, blocking foreign assets, freezing financial transactions usually on a temporary basis during a specific crisis. It wasn't seen as a tool for fundamentally rewriting trade policy or, frankly, raising revenue on a massive scale.
And the context of its creation matters too, right? You said it was meant to limit power.
Exactly. It was passed partly in a reaction to President Nixon's use of the older TWA law to impose a 10% import surcharge in the early 70s. Congress saw that as problematic and wanted tighter controls. IEPA was supposed to provide those controls. The argument continues. When Congress has wanted to give the president authority to adjust tariffs, like in the Trade Act of 1974, it did so very explicitly, and it included clear procedures and strict limits. IEPA lacks that specific language and structure for tariffs.
Okay, that's the constitutional argument. Let's talk about the actual court cases. Several federal courts looked at this, didn't they? What did they find initially?
Yes, the legal challenges came quickly. On May 28, 2025, we got a ruling from the U.S. Court of International Trade, the CIT. This was in a case called VOS Selections in the United States. It was actually consolidated with another case brought by several states led by Oregon. The CIT ruled that President Trump had overstepped his authority under IEPA. Specifically, they found that the national emergency declared the trade deficit and fentanyl trafficking didn't have a rational connection, a close enough link to the broad tariff measures imposed, so the tariffs were deemed unlawful.
Okay, one court ruling against the tariffs, were there others?
Yes. Separately, over in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, there was another case, Learning Resources v. Trump. That court went even further. It held that IEPA simply does not authorize the president to impose tariffs at all. Full stop.
Wow, so a more fundamental rejection there.
It's also worth mentioning that a group of prominent legal scholars, former government officials from both parties, weighed in. They filed what's called an amici curiae brief, basically, friends of the court. They weren't parties to the case, but they offered their expert legal opinion, arguing strongly that IEPA doesn't grant this kind of tariff power and emphasizing the importance of maintaining the constitutional separation of powers.
So, two significant lower court rulings against the administration's tariff strategy, backed by expert opinion. What happened when these were appealed?
As expected, the administration appealed both rulings. The cases went up to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. On August 29, 2025, the Federal Circuit issued its decision. It was a 7-4 ruling, and they upheld the lower courts. They agreed that President Trump had exceeded his statutory authority under IEPA. The majority opinion reaffirmed the principle that setting tariffs is primarily a power Congress holds, not the president, unless explicitly delegated for that purpose.
Did the appeals court mention anything else significant?
Yes, they also brought up something called the major questions doctrine.
Okay, what's that?
It's a principle the Supreme Court has increasingly used. It basically says that if an executive agency or the president wants to implement a policy that has vast economic and political significance, like major question, they need clear, explicit authorization from Congress to do so. You can't just find that power lurking in vague or ambiguous language in an old statute. Imposing broad tariffs certainly qualifies as a major question. So the court was signaling this is too big a deal to be done based on an arguably creative reading of IEEPA. It requires Congress to speak clearly. This isn't just semantics, it's about who fundamentally gets to make these huge economic decisions.
That's a really powerful legal concept. So the appeals court upholds the rulings against the tariffs. What does that mean for the tariffs themselves? Are they just switched off now?
Not immediately, no. The
And-
Federal Circuit did something common in these situations. They imposed a stay of execution on their own ruling. They basically paused the effect of their decision until October 14th, 2025,
And why do that?
to give the administration time to appeal to the final authority, the U.S. Supreme Court. Everyone expects the Supreme Court will agree to hear the case, likely sometime in the second half of October. So the ultimate fate of these tariffs, and perhaps the president's power to use IEEPA this way in the future, rests with the 9 justices. Their decision will be truly pivotal. It will determine whether setting tariffs remains primarily Congress's job, rooted in legislation, or if it becomes more of a flexible tool for presidential foreign policy and economic management. Foundational principles are definitely at stake.
A major constitutional showdown heading to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, businesses can't just hit pause, can they? They have to operate now. We saw some insights from Deloitte on how companies are trying to cope. Can you share some of that?
Right. And connecting this legal battle back to the real world for businesses. These tariff policies, regardless of their legality, represent a fundamental shift. We're moving away from tariffs being just about, say, protecting a specific industry or raising a bit of revenue. Now they're being used, or attempted to be used, to actively reshape global supply chains and commercial ties. That introduces massive unpredictability. And the key takeaway, looking at analysis like Deloitte's, is that tariffs are absolutely not just a niche issue for the logistics or trade compliance department anymore. Their impact ripples across the entire organization: finance, legal, risk, supply chain, strategy, everything.
So it demands a much more integrated response then. You can't just have silos dealing with it.
Exactly that. A coordinated, multidisciplinary approach is essential. You need leaders from tax, legal, risk, supply chain, finance, operations, all talking to each other, all collaborating. Making decisions in isolation in this kind of volatile environment can be incredibly costly, leading to missed opportunities or unexpected liabilities.
That makes complete sense. Is there a specific framework or approach businesses can use to structure that response?
Deloitte suggests a useful 3-phase framework: respond, refresh, and reinvent.
Okay, respond, refresh, reinvent. Let's break that down. What's respond?
Respond is the immediate reaction. It's about managing the here and now. First, you have to understand exactly how the current tariffs, or the potential for new ones, impact your current business model. Assess your existing operations, your supply chains, your costs. Then identify immediate steps to mitigate the negative effects. This can involve things like deep dives into complex rules of origin to see if sourcing changes can help, or using specific strategies for managing customs valuation to potentially lower the duty base. Tactical moves.
Okay, so triage and immediate fixes. What's refresh?
Refresh is about looking longer term and building resilience. This involves scenario planning. What if tariffs stay high? What if they change again? What if they spread to new areas? Businesses start modeling different potential futures. Maybe exploring incremental changes like finding alternative suppliers in unaffected countries, or maybe even envisioning entirely new operational solutions. This could mean entering new geographic markets, adopting different production processes, maybe investing in automation or AI to offset costs. You're stress testing your business model against future uncertainty. You consider things like your profit margins, how much you can pass costs on to customers, the role of technology.
So planning for different futures. And the last phase, reinvent. That sounds pretty ambitious.
It is. Reinvent is the most strategic and potentially transformative stage. It's about fundamentally rethinking your business model. Instead of just adapting to the current trade environment, you proactively try to reshape how your company creates value, how it delivers products or services, how it competes. This might involve making really bold choices about where you operate, what you produce, who your core customers are. It challenges fundamental strategic assumptions. It's about turning disruption into a potential long-term advantage.
Respond, refresh, reinvent. That sounds like a really solid framework for businesses trying to navigate this, not just reacting, but actually building a more robust future, whatever the Supreme Court decides. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems crystal clear that IEEPA, this International Emergency Economic Powers Act, is undeniably a potent tool. It was designed for presidential action in genuinely extraordinary situations, but using it for broad economic tariffs has really pushed the boundaries and sparked this huge constitutional debate about the limits of executive power.
Absolutely. We've walked through how the Liberation Day tariffs, despite the reciprocal framing, faced a lot of skepticism from economists and certainly caused significant global market upset. And crucially, we've seen consistent rulings from the federal court so far. They've clearly stated that, in their view, IEPA doesn't give the president a blank check to impose tariffs whenever they see fit. They've emphasized that power fundamentally rests with Congress.
And now all eyes are on the Supreme Court. Their decision is going to be massive, setting precedent for years to come on executive power and trade. For businesses listening, this ongoing uncertainty really highlights that need for flexibility, for that multidisciplinary approach you mentioned, moving beyond just reacting, towards refreshing and maybe even reinventing how they operate.
What we've really explored today goes beyond just a legal fight over tariffs, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a critical moment that's testing the fundamental checks and balances of American government.
We certainly hope this deep dive has given you, our listeners, a clearer picture of IEEPA, these recent tariff actions, and the really profound legal and economic ripple effects that are still unfolding. A complex story touching the very structure of our government and the flows of global commerce. Hopefully you have a better grasp now of how law, policy, and the markets all interact.
And perhaps this whole saga serves as a reminder, in a world overflowing with complex information, critical thinking, and really understanding the underlying structures, who holds power, where it comes from, how it's checked, it's just more essential than ever. It's a lesson in how laws, even decades-old ones, continue to shape our present and future.
Thank you so much for joining us on this important journey today. All the best, and we will meet again with another important matter in the next meeting.